Hello there, welcome to the latest episode of Watch This Movie, Mike. I am your host, Mike. So before we get into this episode's movie recommendation, or pick of the episode, or whatever you would like to refer to it, I just wanted to let everyone know that, the shows have been a little bit delayed from last week going into this week. You know, your boy had a jury duty assignment, which just wrapped up today. And it kind of kept me away from all the extracurricular free time that goes into, editing, podcast, post-production, all that stuff. So, luckily, my jury duty only lasted a few days, and I will be back to my normal schedule. So I figured, hey, let's get right back into podcasting and editing and all that kind of stuff. I don't know if you guys have ever served jury duty before. I actually hadn't served in over 20 years when I was like 19 years old, maybe. Man, the things you remember about the experience, you know, they carry over for the most part. It felt like very similar, but I really dug the judge in this case. And I always think our legal system here in the good old US of A, it's very interesting. It's kind of fascinating when you get to see it, and unfortunately it doesn't always seem to work like it's supposed to. But in this case, I felt like it did. Now, the case is officially wrapped, so I am allowed to talk about it. It was just it was a very, I would say, minor case. A few misdemeanor counts, including driving under the influence. And I thought the prosecution did a valiant job, but the defense was excellent. I felt the defense kind of had good answers to get across reasonable doubt, and that's really all you need in our legal system, at least in criminal cases. I think civil might be a little different, but in criminal cases, you know, that's why they say got to be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, otherwise you go with not guilty. Yeah, I thought deliberating with the jury was cool. I mean, we were mostly on the same page. We did, some of us had to do a little bit of swaying, or, you know, and we were trying to be swayed. But for the most part, the deliberations lasted just a day. Like I said, it wasn't a major case, thank goodness. I am fortunate that my work pays my full salary while I'm out on jury duty, but it seems like there's always some stipulation to it with a lot of companies, like they say, but if it starts going like beyond a couple of weeks, I don't know. I don't know if what would happen. But that didn't happen here. But I'm glad to be back, because I really meant to have this show out sometime last week, and it's gotten pushed to the middle of this week along with my other shows. So, you know, with that, I guess we'll get into this episode's movie recommendation. Now, you know, I come from a horror movie background. That was kind of my first love when it comes to cinema. And I really like going back and watching older horror movies when possible, filling in gaps to see, you know, what I had missed before. And there's an old Italian director who's no longer with us that was definitely inspiration to some of my favorite directors. And he's done a ton of films, and one I had actually seen like a long time ago, but not enough to remember everything, is Mario Bava. So if you are familiar with him a little bit, maybe you've seen this movie. I mean, he's known for the movie Black Sunday, Kill Baby Kill, The Evil Eye, Blood and Black Lace. But today's recommendation will be none of those, but instead it is going to be Black Sabbath. Now, this is a horror anthology, 3 stories. Boris Karloff, famous Boris Karloff, is the host of the anthology. And, you know, I think all 3 stories in this movie are strong, but I've got to say the third story, the final story, The Drop of Water, is just over the top, creepy as hell. And the other main thing that jumps out is the cinematography, the use of color. Like, damn near every scene in this, he's got like the purples, the blues, the greens, the reds, just the hue. There's contrast all the time different parts of the screen. It's just a beautiful movie to look at. And keep in mind that this movie came out all the way back in 1963. So you're seeing some of these techniques for the first time that eventually make their way to other directors, other countries, other films. But it's always nice to see like where some of this started at. So I highly recommend Black Sabbath from 1963. And I want to say, yeah, it's currently on Shudder, which is like the horror streaming service. And how about a fun fact from Black Sabbath? Because I didn't even know this, although it makes sense. Because when you say Black Sabbath, I think the first thing that comes to people's minds is the heavy metal band Black Sabbath, or at least, I don't know, some people might not refer to Black Sabbath as heavy metal, but at least they're like, the godfathers, grandfathers, the OGs of the genre. They, tons of hits. Ozzy was the lead singer for a good while. Eventually they went on to be fronted by Dio. But more to this point is, I guess Black Sabbath was originally called Earth. That was their name, Earth. Not quite the same cool ring to it, nor does it really match their sound, I guess, But as the story goes, is they were playing a small club in England, and Black Sabbath was actually showing at a theater across the street from where they, whatever club they were playing at, and the band couldn't, overlook the fact that so many more people were in line for Black Sabbath than to see them. So they had the idea that, well, horror sells tickets, and they decided to change their name to Black Sabbath, and the rest was history. And I gotta say, the name Black Sabbath 100% goes with their music. I mean, I'm not sure if all the listeners are familiar with Black Sabbath's music, but listen to a couple of their songs and you understand why the name Black Sabbath kind of fit. So I guess, there was some fun trivia mixed in there with the movie recommendation. Now, the other thing I will say is, a big reason I am recommending this one over other Bava movies, because plenty of great Bava. If you like the style, you like the style. I think anthologies are a great way to jump into like a new genre, a new director, a new style, something you haven't seen before, because the stories in them obviously tend to be shorter than one feature-length story. So because you get a variety of stuff going on, if you're not a huge fan of one story, you won't have to wait that much longer until something new pops up for you to check out. Although I think, like I already said, I think this whole anthology is strong. The music is great. Like I said, the cinematography, it just is a beautiful movie to look at. Great acting, and yeah, I think by the time you get to The Drop of Water, the last story, you're already going to be fully on board. But that one just puts you over the top. It's super creepy and well worth the wait to get to it. So that's why I'm recommending Mario Bava's Black Sabbath for everyone to watch. And let me know. Maybe you've already seen it and you got opinions about it. Maybe you haven't seen it yet, and this will get you to check it out. But yeah, look it up. Check it out. Black Sabbath by Mario Bava. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get into the show. Thanks everyone for coming back to listen, and let's get to it. Alright, so let's go ahead and bring in our guest of the episode right now, Mr. Bo Ransdell. What's up, Bo? How's it going?
It's going great. As we're recording this, it is a Sunday morning. I have coffee, and as long as I have coffee and, continue to breathe on this side of the flowers, I'm in pretty good shape.
Well, here's the thing. I have a giant jug of ice water. Coffee will be my goal at the end of the episode to go make for myself and probably my wife. So with that beautiful, huge cup of coffee that's coming. Let's get right into this. Yeah, it's an early Sunday morning over here on the West Coast, but hey, I've done it before. It's part of the podcasting life, all sorts of times and days. You're recording, nothing new to me, but this is a pleasure to have you join me on this. And, for people that aren't quite as familiar with Bo, I figured, I would ask you a couple questions, just getting to know you. So for those that do know you, it's mostly from horror podcasting, maybe Legion Network. You have dabbled in the video podcast. I don't know if there's like a short version of that yet, do people say V-podding yet or anything like that?
Like a vlog? I don't know. I mean, I guess
vlog would be the closest
I think
that we
so.
have.
Yeah, it's tough to say. I don't know exactly how you would refer to it, but yeah, I mean, it's as time allows. Like, I enjoy doing the video stuff, but as you well know, just doing podcasting in general, getting people's schedules to line up and making sure that their connection is good and the mic is good, and they don't have state secrets behind them on the shelf or whatever. You want to take into account people's privacy and so forth. And so it's tough. I would love to do more of it. But it's fun. I like Duncan and I do it every couple of weeks. Like those are recorded live and the video for those goes up on YouTube. And I like those a lot because we don't lean into visual jokes, but sometimes just the expression on the other person's face when you say something outrageous or ridiculous or controversial can be a lot of fun. It feels more real at times than just the audio only version of the podcast. But yeah, I dig it. I think it's fun.
Yeah, and I find that recording with video, I think there's less, I don't know if I would say pressure, but almost less self-critique than going back in this one aspect. Because obviously with video, well, I would say certain people's videos production, there's tons of editing and fixing up that goes on afterwards. But there's also, I would say, an aspect to video that allows the flow of conversation more so, where with audio, when you're dealing with the audio file, sometimes you want to break out every extra piece of dead air or every or all this extra audio, where with the video, where it makes sense within the context because you're actually seeing the people, it's like you don't even feel the need to cut out some of that stuff. So it kind of helps.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, there is a real like when we do the Pick Six podcast, that is one where the editing process is really, really tough, because of just what you're talking about, like cutting out all the ands and ums, and we go so far as to cut out breath, and so you don't hear people inhale and exhale on that show, in an effort just to make that as quick a show as possible. And also it's a momentum thing that, like, when you're listening to that show, the conversation happens so quick that I think the goal is just to make it so that people can't turn it off, because it doesn't ever stop. Like, there's no pause, which from a biological point of view, probably not a great idea, because it's when people take a breath and when they pause that as a listener, you process what they say. But I also think that's an aim of that kind of editing, is like, we don't want you to think for 2 seconds about what you're hearing. Otherwise, you might think better of listening. So it's a real, like, bullet of a podcast. Even though they're long, they're a couple hour episodes, but they just truck, So yeah, it's different schools of thought, but I hate editing that show because it's a real pain to do it. But I'm generally happy with the results.
Yeah, I mean, that's usually for us. I would classify myself definitely as an amateur. It's like that's where I want to be. Just get happy with the end result, and I'm good to go with the limited time and resources, right?
Yeah, and it's the decision you make early on when you're starting a podcast of any kind of like what is this format going to be? What is it going to allow? How is the editing going to work? And that's why when I do the Dark Parade stuff, which is the horror podcast that I do, there isn't a lot of editing with that. It's a lot more conversational, and I thought that was because of the experience I had editing with Pick Six movies. I wanted something that I could turn around a lot faster and not spend hours on the edit. And so I just make notes as I go through. If I'm recording something, I'm coughing or I lose my train of thought or whatever, I'll just make a little note like, okay, here I need to do an edit at this time code. But I don't get crazy about all the ands and ums and that kind of thing.
Yeah, what I've been doing this for a number of years where my old setup, I could actually record Skype calls through my editing software, and I was able to always have the options open where I could just click and set a marker on like any part I felt I needed to go back and look at for whatever reason. Like I wouldn't always have a description, but I would just have that visual marker to say, hey, at this point something happened that you might want to scratch out. And the weirdest thing happened is I moved my setup inside. I bought a better microphone, and suddenly, for whatever reason, when I would try to do the same thing, the audio program would pick up my audio, but not everyone else on the call. So now I'm editing the old-fashioned way, just listening through the audio file afterwards. But eventually I'll have time to investigate what the issue was, but for now I'm just getting by the way it is. But hey, I guess that's podcast editing 101 to start off the show.
Right.
You never know where it's going to go, right?
Right, for all you burgeoning podcasters out there, you can just cast your mind forward to after you've done 4 or 5 episodes, and then you can just start genuinely complaining about the edit process. That's really one of the joys of podcasting is commiserating with other hosts about how much of a pain that is. Because nobody likes it. Nobody has a good time editing. Or at least very few people that I know. Maybe Richard Glenschmidt from Hello, This is the Doom Show, which is a personal favorite show of mine. And I think you can hear in that show when he gets bored, because he'll start playing around with the tone and pace of the voices. And it's very entertaining as a listener, but also I'm pretty sure that happens just because as Richard's going through the show, he'll be like, I'm starting to get bored with this. And that means that the listener might be bored. So I'm going to do something weird in the editing to kind of keep it moving and keep it interesting. But I really like it. I think that's cool.
Yeah. And that it's also one of the things where it's like out of a cast of like 4 or 5 from the show, like the one guy always relates because it's the one person that handles all the editing duty, and they're like, yep, my own co-hosts don't know what it's like.
Yeah. If you're hosting a podcast and have never done an edit on one, then you don't have an appreciation for things like keeping the conversation moving and all the things that make the edit easier, because you don't have to spend a bunch of time cutting stuff out and cutting around stuff. And so I probably make the mistake of filling gaps where they don't need to be filled just because I want the editing to go smoothly. And I'm like, well, if I'm talking, it may not be gold, but it's not silence. And the silence is the thing you have to cut out, because there's nothing as a listener, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and there's nothing I like less when I'm listening to a podcast than just a big hunk of silence that hasn't been cut out of it, because that feels like I'm wasting my time. That's all just dead air. Same thing with like being a DJ. You don't want dead air. And anyway, so I hope everyone's taking notes if you're planning on being a podcaster, because this is all fantastic advice.
Yeah, I feel like you've helped me create a new sidecast within a sidecast. That's
Yeah, right,
yeah.
right. Just how
All
to
right.
podcast 101.
Yeah. All right. Well, I figure, my listeners right now, I'm sure some are familiar with you, some maybe have heard the name, some maybe not at all. You've been podcasting, I'd say mostly with horror movies, the genre, all things horror,
Hmm.
for a good while now. But maybe people don't know what really got you into podcasting. As far as I remember, because even this time period is starting to get hazy for me a little bit. I think I first heard you when you came onto Devour. I think you joined them at some point, and I'm trying to think. Like I want to say I knew you or knew of you before that, maybe your name, but I'm like I don't know if that was his first major podcast or not. But how'd you first get kind of mixed up in the podcasting world?
Well, we started a long time ago. Jamie and I had a blog. Jamie, now Salmons, Jenkins at the time, and I started a horror blog years ago. I don't even remember the date. I mean, it's been 15 years ago, maybe more than that, maybe a little less. But anyway, and ahead of last podcast on the left, it was called Last Blog on the Left, which I think they have since sort of taken that domain. But anyway, doesn't matter. And so we did. This was in the early days of podcasts. And Jamie and I decided, like, oh, let's do a recorded part because the worst thing about doing movie reviews is writing them. And so let's just do it all as part of a conversation. So we started that. We did that for a couple of years. And then, life just happens. And I got busy with some other stuff, as did she. And so we ended up kind of shutting that down. And so I didn't podcast for a while after that. And I was, I'm a horror nerd. I still watched horror movies and still had plenty of opinions about them, but I was keeping them all to myself. And then Jamie had started doing Devour with David Anders. And she invited me on for a guest spot. And I had so much fun because at that point I didn't have to edit any of the Devour stuff. And so I didn't for most of that run. And so I did a guest spot and then I just kept coming back until eventually it was just like, oh, okay, I'm part of this show now. And it was fairly early on. I want to say it was like episode 13, somewhere in that neighborhood, that I jumped on. And so I did Devour for a long time and then just sort of branched out into doing a handful of shows that I've been doing for a while. Like I've been doing Pick Six movies now for 5-ish years, somewhere in that neighborhood. And is that right? Yeah, it's probably close. And um, been doing Duncan and Bo Come Correct with Duncan McLeish of Podcast Under the Stairs. We've been doing that for 7 or 8 years. And then started the Dark Parade recently because those two shows are a lot of fun. But, my first love is always horror. And I wasn't really, on either of those shows, we don't necessarily spend a lot of time talking about horror movies. And I also wanted to use it as an excuse to kind of keep up with current releases as well as exploring my fascination with certain subgenres. And so Dark Parade, I kind of picked that name because I wanted it to be a lot of different stuff and didn't want to marry myself to a single format so that I could sort of decide, hey, this week I want to do a discussion about this found footage movie, and this week I want to have one of those conversations like we used to do with Jamie and I, where we just talk about movies that we've been watching, and then this other episode that I want to do a deep dive on a movie with a guest, and being able to do all of that stuff within the same under the same umbrella of a podcast has been really, really fun. And I've had other shows here and there over the years, but those are kind of the mainstays. And but yeah, I mean, I really got into it just because I always wanted to do radio, but I didn't want to DJ. I just wanted to talk about horror movies. And then when podcasts happened, it was like, oh, well, this is exactly what I've wanted to do. So yeah, so that got me into it, and I've taken breaks over time. The one between Last Blog and Devour was the longest because I probably didn't podcast for several years. But once I started doing Devour, it's been pretty. It's been a staple of my life since then.
Yeah, it's been steady. You've been around. You've been around, always involved in something, right? It's never, not too much time goes by where I don't at least see your name come across my feed somewhere for something. So it's been a steady diet of Bo Ransdell. Ever since.
Yeah, I mean, some would say that is not a good thing, but yeah, I because I at the end of the day, I love the genre and I love to talk about it. And I love to think about it. And as I get older, my background is in sort of literary analysis. And so I like to dig into that stuff, that's some of my favorite things to do. I mean, aside from the dumb found footage movies that I just love despite myself, like I don't have a good explanation for any of that. But when we're doing the deep dives on movies, I really like to dig into them and talk about, as like you've been on Dark Parade, so we talk about theme and get into the characters and try to explore the movie in a pretty thorough way so that both me as a creator and the listener leaving those episodes, those deep dive episodes, that you feel like I have a pretty good understanding of the context in which this movie was made and what the filmmakers were going for, or in some cases just like, hey, this is a really silly movie, but let's kind of talk about it in terms of when the movie happened and what makes it worthwhile for discussion in some ways, rather than I my criticism of a lot of horror podcasts is a lot of times it ends up just being, hey, this movie's cool. Yeah, this is cool. And it never scratches the surface beyond that, other than to sort of do this listing, like 7 horror movies you can't not see before you die or whatever. And that stuff has its place and it's interesting to some extent, but I spend too much of my life writing essays and reading essays and stuff like that, not to get at least a little bit scholarly with it without trying to make it too dry.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I like the way you described kind of like the feeling of wanting to be a radio DJ, and then like this is kind of like the next thing or the next best thing, because I just want to, or you just wanted to talk about horror movies in that kind of format. And I found that kind of poignant because I remember I gotta say, wow, it's been at least 20 years maybe, or 20-ish, or just around 20. Is I remember working at jobs at the time and telling people, most people that would have headphones on were listening to music at the time, and people would ask what I was listening to. And I remember just saying the word podcast, and you would get these looks from people. And what was the way you would describe it at the time? That's exactly how I described it. It is like, well, think of a radio show, but it's recorded and you're just listening to like a recording of it. But, in this case, it's designed to be recorded and listened to after the fact. And it kind of explained it well to people, but podcasts were such a small thing at the time that like the majority of people weren't really listening to them, at least at work. And then now, fast forward to now, and it's like, I'd be surprised if most people with headphones in aren't listening to some podcast about whatever topic, So it's definitely a whole different world just when it comes to podcasts. I'll discover a podcast now that has like millions of downloads, and I'd never even heard of it because of how
Hmm.
big the market is out there. And sometimes I'll think it's really good and be like, how did I not know about this?
Yeah, yeah. But as you said, it's just there are so many shows out there, and there are so many people creating at this point that you just got to pick the thing that you're into. And there's absolutely going to. I'll tell you here, with some exceptions, because one thing I have found a real problem finding is a podcast that's about English grammar, and which you have to be a special kind of nerd to be on the hunt for one of those things anyway. But I happen to be such a nerd and was looking for a good grammar podcast. Doesn't seem to be one, but what are you gonna do? Worse problems facing us in the world for sure. But I was a bit disappointed. But yeah, but that exception, that weirdo case aside, there are incredible podcasts on just about. I mean, obviously like true crime and horror movies and movie history, and I mean, you name it, and there is a show that will help explore history and et cetera, et cetera. It's so good.
For sure. So since since horror is your genre, I mean, obviously you take in all sorts of cinema, but horror kind of being like the original genre that grabbed you. Do you have a particular movie that set you on the course? Now I know a lot of people skew it as the very first horror movie you watched, but I don't always think it's like necessarily the first horror movie someone saw, but maybe in your case it is. But do you have one that kind of like said, okay, I need to explore more of this genre and everything? Like what kind of planted that seed in the ground?
Yeah, this is a story I've told before, so apologies if you're listening to this and you've heard me tell this, but it's I think kind of fundamental to my makeup as a person. There was a point where I saw the movie Alien in the theater. I was of an age where that can be a true thing. And when I saw it, I was 5, something like that, 5 or 6 years old, too young to be seeing Alien. I remember asking my stepmom at one point, "Why did you guys take me to see that?" Because I was clearly too young to be seeing Alien in the theater. And she said, "Oh, that wasn't our idea. We took you because you wouldn't shut up about it," which was the thing I didn't remember. But apparently, I saw the TV preview for Alien, the TV trailer for it, and would not leave them alone about going to see the movie. Something about it just captured my imagination. And so when I saw it, she said that I stood on the seat and leaned forward so that my arms were folded on the headrest of the seat in front of me. And she said, "I don't think you blinked the entire movie." That it was just, a 6-year-old kid, wide-eyed, taking in every bit of the movie Alien at a very young age. And I there were parts of that experience I don't remember. I remember going to see the movie, and I remember it scaring me pretty good, as you would imagine, in the weeks that followed. But also for Christmas, I asked for this alien, like action figure that stood about a foot tall and had a little button on the back of its head that if you pulled on it, it would extend the jaws, the second set of jaws of the alien. And yeah, so I just loved it. I mean, right out of the gate, Alien was the movie that set me on the path, but I was pretty quick to devour anything I could. And again, just being the age that I am, I also had the good fortune to be alive when, Saturday afternoons would be old monster movies and Godzilla movies and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And so I just, like, I had a steady diet of horror movies and creature features from the time I was, 5, 6, 7 years old. So yeah, I've seen way more horror movies than anyone should. But it's also kind of nice. Again, I keep saying being the age I am, but one of the benefits to that is you get to really appreciate, how the genre has changed. And like, I kind of cut my teeth on movies that were made in the 50s and 60s, got to grow up in the 80s and the VHS boom, and to see all of that, and to see, the international scope in the 90s start to broaden. And yeah, it's been, a kind of a tremendous journey through the genre over the years. But I started young. I started real young. I was a junkie from early on.
Yeah, I kind of have a similar experience. Just like my parents always had. Well, I would say more my dad had them on the TV, but my mom was pretty. I she was pretty indifferent to what I watched, and my dad would always have like, Godzilla movies on. And back then, as a kid, a lot of times you had a choice: either sit down and watch what your parents happen to be watching, or go do something else. Like it wasn't like the choice of like, okay, well, I'll just go to my room and throw on this Netflix or HBO Max or something with 1,000 other choices. It was like there's only one choice for the TV, and it's a matter of whether I'm willing to watch what my dad is watching. And while my dad did like horror, I think my bigger overall credit is the fact that he just liked all sorts of different movies, and it kind of shaped me early on just to like, hey, go out and check out different things. So when we would go to the VHS store, I would find the specific sections that would be familiar with what he was watching, and it kind of got me to just check out different things at a young age, which helps, because then once the world started changing and you get the access to much more of those types of movies, then it's really on, right? Then you can really start doing your research.
Yeah, yeah. I think it was, what, early 2000s, I guess, when the J horror stuff hit, and it was like, oh, there's this too. Oh wow, and it was sort of like the Paul on the road to Damascus, where all of a sudden it was like, oh, I don't have to just watch American horror movies, which this will, I'm sure, alienate some people, but like 90s horror was kind of a bummer for me, because it was very, very Scream influenced, and I've never been um a big slasher guy. Like there are some slashers I really like, but it's not my preferred subgenre of horror. And the 90s were just slasher heavy. And especially that kind of self-aware meta sort of slasher film that just didn't hold a whole lot of interest for me, especially after you'd seen, Scream and the good ones, and then everything else felt sort of a pale imitation of those. And then all of a sudden international movies really started to become a big part of my cinematic diet, and just reignited my love of the genre, and made me feel like, oh, okay, well, maybe I'm not that interested in what American horror cinema is doing, but what's going on in Korea and Japan is incredible. And so I'm on board with that for a while now. And yeah, but you see all that stuff go in waves, because now American horror cinema is really groundbreaking in a lot of ways. So it's fun to see all that stuff kind of the wheel on that turn.
Yeah, and I think, as you put it, like the early 2000s, when we kind of, because that's probably when we were transitioning from like internet 1.0 to like 2.0, where it got that many steps bigger. For film enthusiasts, suddenly like your average Joe Schmo had access to stuff that like only professional critics at film festivals would see, and then the rest of us would be lucky if 2 years from now it got like a one night showing at a random theater. But now we were getting access, and not always to everything, but just a lot more international movies. It was pushing the boundaries of probably what a lot of us were used to seeing. It was expanding our knowledge and interests, and kind of blowing our minds in a certain way. And in turn, I mean, that always has the effect of then modifying like American films to like, okay, we need to introduce and put some of those elements in ours. And to me, anytime you open up access to more stuff, it's always going to have a positive net effect, because it's just going to constantly push the boundaries of what everybody's doing. So I thought it was like a very exciting time to discover the J Horde and the French movies. There was even like Australian movie renaissance, New Zealand, like all sorts of regions just popping up on everyone's radar that previously maybe there'd be like one VHS copy of a random movie in a store. But yeah, definitely those early 2000s was a great time period for this.
Yeah. The French extreme stuff in particular was one of those things of like, what's going on in France? What is wrong with these people? Yeah, that stuff was great. But that's always exciting. And like you said, the internet, I think, really opened the door to a broader discussion where not only did you have communities of people that were, coming together around being horror fans, but there was that exchange of movies where you would say, oh, I really like this movie, and get a recommendation based on that. Like, oh, I really liked, the Blair Witch Project. Oh, have you seen Wreck? Or have you seen, these other foreign films that are like, well, if you like found footage, then here are some incredible found footage movies that, weren't getting a lot of press here in the States, but were, fantastic movies. And yeah. So that stuff is really fun. It's always exciting when you fall in love with a movie and then you tell somebody and they're like, oh, well, if you like that, let me tell you about this other movie that you may never have heard of because it's somewhat obscure, but because we live in a world now where, there is a big community for these kinds of films, that, yeah, you get some great recommendations. I every now and again I'll feel a little despondent because I feel like, oh, I've not that I've seen everything, but I've seen most of the things that need to be seen. But then I also will look through a list and be like, oh, you know what I've never seen? Whatever Happened to Baby Jane? Never watched it, but I use that as an example because that is a thing on my list for this year, so that I can, fill in those gaps. But yeah, it's fun to find those new favorites, and also this is somewhat unrelated to the question you were asking, but I also really love it when a new movie will come out and immediately become one of your favorite movies you've ever seen. That is, that makes me happier than anything. Like the first time I saw Robert Eggers' The Witch, and I realized like, oh, this movie is absolutely my jam and one of my favorite horror movies. And the idea that one of my favorite movies of all time I've seen within the past decade is incredibly exciting to me.
Yeah, and when that situation happens for me, it always becomes sort of an instant internal struggle, because my general way of thinking when it comes to movies and how I view them in like an all-time ranking or enjoyment is I try to never give an ultimate judgment after seeing a movie one time, because I'm like, how can one viewing of a movie compare to like, movies I've seen over the course of like the last 30 plus years of my life that the love has either grown or fallen off. It's hard to do, or it's hard to compare with like a movie that I just saw once and I loved it, But I'm like, is that just because it's fresh and new to me? And sometimes it's like, no, you just gotta like go with it and say, no, I actually do enjoy this movie as much as like these movies that I've said I've loved for my whole life. And
Hmm.
sometimes you run into movies that are just that good that you just have to let it let it be.
Yeah, yeah, and you try not to be sacred. There are some movies I love just because I love them. Like the movie Fright Night, the original Fright Night, is a movie that I dearly love because at the time I first saw it, it was a combination of everything I wanted from a horror movie. And I understand people watching it today for the first time and not responding to it in that way, but it will always be that hometown favorite for me. But I try not to be too colored by nostalgia. And I think nostalgia, is a little dangerous in that it if you lean too hard into the idea that everything was better when you were a kid, it's just like everything was new when you were a kid. And you like the things that you like because you grew up with them. um and there's a fondness to that, and nostalgic gives everything that sort of sepia glow. But you can't allow yourself to be so trapped by nostalgia that you don't allow for things to also be good now. Like whether it's The Witch or Hereditary or any of the other handful of new movies that these really talented new directors have come out with, and just done such tremendous work that not only like that's the thing that really kind of charges the battery. It makes you excited to see what's next. And like there
Mm-hmm.
will never be a time after Robert Eggers did The Witch and The Lighthouse that I won't be excited to see what Robert Eggers is doing next. And
Yeah.
so it that to me is really fun. Like the Coen brothers aren't really making movies anymore, and as much as I love the Coen brothers, they're not really what they were when I was a kid. And so now, my attention shifts to other directors that are, doing really exciting and interesting things with film. And yeah, that stuff is great. I love that. There is nothing better to me than that sense of discovery of finding a movie or a director or even a subgenre of film that you've never seen before. Like when, what was it? What was the Romero film that Shudder re-released? Not the Funhouse,
The
but
amusement
the
park.
the amusement park. Yeah, when that hit, and it was like, oh, I get to watch a George Romero movie I've never seen. That's how incredible a time is it that we live in.
Yeah.
And regardless of how you responded to it, I really liked it. I thought it was great. But even if you don't like, oh, you get to see a movie by one of the most important horror directors that you've never seen before. And somebody who like Romero, who trafficked in sociopolitical not just horror films but just movies in general. Like his movies really were always intended to say something. And even when they were commissioned by Mormons who paid George Romero, the guy who did Night of the Living Dead, to do a somewhat PSA oriented movie. And when they got it, they were like, what is this? And it's like, yeah, you hired George Romero to do a PSA film, so you ought to have known what you were getting into there. But that stuff's super fun. I there is nothing I like more than seeing something exciting from a new director or getting like those new discoveries from old directors that I love. So I don't remember what question he asked. I was just excited about movies.
Yeah, I was just like I'm just appreciating talking about movies. But yeah, that's one of my other fun things to do. If it's not, seeking out new releases that, didn't jump out right when they released them, randomly showed up somewhere where I could watch them. My other favorite thing to do is kind of go back and look over directors or even sometimes actors that I'm fond of and just try to fill in gaps of their stuff that I haven't seen. Because there's always tends to be like missing pieces. Like I recently kind of went on like a De Palma kick, and it was just I just looked up his filmography and was like, okay, haven't seen these ones, and I'm just gonna watch them, and it brings like even a bigger appreciation. Or I think in the past I've done like where I love Rosemary's Baby, and I just like Googled movies like Rosemary's Baby and tried to see like what some of the better ranked ones or reviewed ones were, and just checked those out and had a blast doing that. So I don't even know what question I'm answering now either on my own, but
well,
just the enjoyment of exploring cinema, basically.
Yeah, recently I like Duncan is really into giallo films. Richard's really a big giallo fan. It's not a thing that I know a ton about, and I don't always like giallo, but I've seen some that really blew me away. And recently I watched The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, which is a Sergio Martino joint, and I realized that I have now seen most of the giallo films that Sergio Martino has done, and that's always fun too, because it's like, oh, if I watch a couple of more movies, I will have, not necessarily an encyclopedic knowledge, but a working knowledge of all of the giallo films of this very prolific Italian director. And that's the kind of nerdy fun I like, where it's like, oh, I can actually talk with some degree of intelligence with Richard now about the films of Sergio Martino. And I keep name checking Richard just because he is maybe the smartest guy I know when it comes to giallo films, or at least has the widest breadth of knowledge about those kinds of movies and the filmmakers involved. So that kind of stuff is really fun when, like you said, you just pick a director or an actor or someone, you're like, I'm just going to learn everything I can about this actor or director. And it helps put all the other movies into kind of a context, and you can start to see some of the through lines, especially if it's a director, where you start to see some recurring themes and shot selections and that kind of thing, where it's like, oh, okay, well, this is, sort of a trademark of this director is to, shoot these weird gauzy looking flashback scenes, or, all of his movies feature a character that is, suffering from some kind of addiction or something like that. That's just a thing that this director likes to explore. And that stuff is really fascinating to me. But as I said, I come from kind of a literary analysis kind of background, and so finding that stuff from directors is a lot of fun for me, because I like trying to understand what the filmmaker is trying to say with the movies, as well as just enjoy. Like, look, I enjoy Japanese splatter movies, and those movies are almost completely devoid of theme and story. I just like them because they're really silly and gory and dumb in a way that I really respond to. So, I think being able to sort of have a varied cinematic diet is important too. That there are some things I take very seriously, and there are some movies that are just meant for, my own personal entertainment or enjoyment, and that's cool too. I tell people all the time, I don't care what gets you into the horror genre, and I'll tell you if I don't like a movie that you like, but I'm not going to give you a hard time for liking it, because whatever movie gets you into horror movies is the right movie for you. And even if my opinion differs, I don't, with the exception of Jamie Salmon's love of the Nightmare on Elm Street remake, I try not to give anyone a hard time about something that they like just because I don't like it,
Well, I'm definitely Team Bo on that one.
It's so bad. It's such a woefully misbegotten movie, and filled with such terrible ideas. And I don't get it. I've talked to her so many times about it. I just don't understand how she can look at and I think at this point she's just being obstinate. I think even she at this point recognizes that it's not a very good movie, but she's been on that hill for so long that she's just decided to plant her flag there.
Yeah, I agree. Like I've heard some of the argument, and not just from her. Right? Like I don't want to make it like she's the only one. I've heard similar things said from other people, and I just think there's too much ammo to fight back on those points, and I'm like, no, like I respect the ability to attempt to make the arguments and the points, but for me, I can't go with it. I'm sorry, like
Yeah.
no.
Yeah, it's just not very good. But yeah,
Yeah, I was going to bring up a specific because you said like the entry point in a horror different for everyone, and I think that I tend to find that Scream is kind of one of those pivotal movies, regardless of what everyone personally thinks of it, because I noticed that there's a big generational, and I think I was talking to somebody off, like not on a podcast, we were just having a conversation about it, and I've noticed that it tends to be a very big generational thing where when Scream came out, you were either someone that was like old enough to have lived through the initial slasher genre scene, and so Scream was like the beginning of the next archetype, or you were young enough to where Scream was your entry point into the slasher genre, and to you that was the archetype, and then anything that came before it that you subsequently saw after the fact um, was like the weird kind of model to you. And that's not to say, because I'm not even here to like bash either type, but just what the individual kind of saw as this is it, and this is the other version of it.
mm-hmm.
I think it still seems to this day Scream is the biggest like kind of like fork in the road, or like the nope, you must turn right or left here because this is where the genre is changing. And I think when it comes to nostalgia and all kind of like the questions surrounding it, I always think that like Scream's like a great example of it, because the way some people talk about it, where it's like that was a pivotal moment in the slasher, versus everyone's like, no, it was actually just another slasher after 15 years of seeing slashers, right? Like I've always kind of like thought it had an interesting dynamic, and I'm always waiting to see like, is there going to be like the next big slasher that kind of does what Scream did in '96? And I'm not sure if we've got it yet.
Yeah, and it's tough to imagine. Like when it happens, it'll be brilliant because it's so difficult to imagine what it would be. Because Scream is such a deconstruction of slasher movies that I always felt like the response to Scream would be to play a slasher movie straight. Like that is the thing that is both beautiful about Scream and it's frustrating about Scream is that no slasher in its wake could get away with just being the slasher movies in the vein of, Friday the 13th or Halloween or The Prowler or, any number of The Burning, whatever 80s slasher you want to pick, because Scream essentially said, okay, well, this is the trope, and laid it out for you. Like there is a character literally saying, here are the rules of the slasher movie, and here's how we're going to sort of upend them. And so you can't do that again. You can't have another movie that just regurgitates the tropes of a slasher movie. And I haven't seen all of the Scream sequels because at a certain point it felt like it was the snake eating its own tail, and you can only deconstruct the deconstruction so many times. But I don't know. I don't know how you make a slasher in a modern context that is both aware of Scream being a thing, but also beholden to the earlier slasher movies. And the one that I wrote is very much in the Scream vein, in the sense that it understands the tropes and tries to subvert them to some degree. But, it also is a throwback movie, so that you don't have to deal with sort of a modern context for the film. It's tough. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the answer is that you just wait for everyone who ever saw a slasher to die, and then make another slasher that's like, oh, well, we've never seen anything quite like this. So I don't know. It's tough. It's like, I think if you were gonna do another movie in the vein of Scream, I think you would almost have to do it as a creature feature or something, where you deconstruct that in the same way that Scream deconstructed the slasher. I think maybe the slasher has been so well mined at this point that you can do movies in that subgenre, but I don't know that you're going to radically reinvent them the way that Scream did. I think you just have to take a different subgenre, and maybe the closest is like Behind the Mask, which does some of the same things that Scream did, of understanding what the tropes are and having a character sort of embody that and lay it out for the audience in a very plain way of like, this is the way it has to be, but also had this kind of clever bent on the material of, presuming that these serial killers that were, almost superhuman, lived in the real world alongside us and all of that. So I don't know. It's tough. It's a great question. I think about it a lot. I just don't know how you do it.
I always looked at It Follows as kind of following somewhat of a slasher prototype.
Mm-hmm.
The main thing missing was, because it's like, I guess, form shifting, or it can be viewed as different things, that it's not going to have this, the singular icon for people to nail down and say, okay, this is where I can go get my It Follows mask at Spirit Halloween store, right? There, you can't you can't really merchandise something that can be multiple faces, but also, it looks like it's probably going to be a standalone movie, and I don't know. I just thought they took a lot of elements. It's kind of like the unstoppable force coming after you. No matter where you are, you're never truly safe. So I felt like they were maybe dabbling in it, but not full force slasher movie. But I did kind of appreciate some of the elements of a slasher there. But yeah, it's kind of tough. Like, I almost say, like, yeah, well, for me, like, the only way to go to like do it is to go back to like what made them originally good, was just a straightforward, masked killer. But then it's like, it has to be done well, because there's already rumors of like a new Friday the 13th, and I'm like, well, okay, I mean, that's not exactly how I would picture doing it. Would be literally resurrecting an 80s franchise again, but looks like that's what they're going to attempt to do, instead of it's just giving us something new. But I mean, that's how it goes, really.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right about It Follows. I think that it thematically, it's certainly doing the same thing of, here is death come for us all, and it doesn't stop, and it can't be reasoned with. That it is very similar to Friday the 13th and Halloween and all that stuff. But yeah, it's tough. But I think when you see horror movies that are being successful in theaters these days, it's just all stripes. I was, one of my favorite movies I've seen this year is Orphan First Kill, because of it subverting the original Orphan, of saying, well, this is what you expect from this movie, and we're going to give that to you, kind of, but then we're going to make this left turn that's going to make the movie sort of its own thing. And I really adore that. And maybe that's the ultimate rule of Scream, is you can make any horror movie you want. You've just got to be creative enough to give it its own spin. And also, I think Lovecraftian horror is something that was a mild thing in the 80s and 90s, but is certainly rampant these days. That seems to be the flavor of the month, if you will.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we've been talking movies for quite a while now. This has been fun. I just have a few more questions. I'm actually going to combine one or two. So I want to know where you kind of got the craving or the urge to create a network, because you created Legion Network, and you were running the network for a while. So maybe touch on what made you go from a podcast to creating a network, and then I'll combine that with the question that you can finish off with on that one is what would you tell, with all your knowledge of running a podcast network now, what would today's Bo let the Bo that wanted to create a network know to it, in case you would do anything different regarding the network in retrospect? So Legion Network, everything Legion Network, Bo.
Yeah, so I didn't actually create it. That was David Anders was the one who originally started. It had a different name when he started. It was a League of Extraordinary Podcasts, something like that. And which was a little unwieldy. I always thought that was a little bit too long a name. But he kind of put it together, and so the original shows that were on Legion came from him and organizing around his idea. And so David started it, and then somewhere along the line decided, hey, I this is a lot of work and I want to do this. And I felt like, well, it is a lot of work, but also it was kind of interesting to see all of these different podcasts sort of assemble and do some cross-pollination and helping each other out and so forth. And so I said, hey, before you just completely shutter this, let me take a swing at it and let me see if I can help with it. And so that's when I took over, and I ran it for years, like 4 or 5 years. And so yeah, and it was, like during part of that, I was just kind of caretaker of making sure that all of the shows got out to the right feeds and did a lot of the technical stuff, because I have a bit of a technical background, so that part of it was really some of the heavy lifting. And as far as what I would tell myself, if I could go back and give myself some good advice, it would be to either outsource early or to spend a lot more time understanding the role of social media in that process, because I don't care for social media. It's not that I dislike people or dislike interacting with people. I just don't like the social media platforms, because most of the time they are sort of fronting, because of the algorithms working underneath it all, they're kind of showing you stuff that they think you're going to like. And I'm one of those people that doesn't like to be told what I like. Like, let me just find the thing that I like, which, it's a personality flaw, I suppose. But so I don't use Facebook a lot anymore. Twitter is something that I've flirted with and never understood, because I believe in having discussions like this, but Twitter is just not set up to have a discussion. It is, I'm going to post my feelings and everybody else can go suck it kind of stuff. And that's just not what I enjoy. So I would try to find somebody early that understood that and could establish a much better social media presence and who enjoyed doing that stuff, because I really hate it. These days I spend most of my time on Discord, because it is not really social media. It's just a community. And so, yeah, that would be the advice. And that is something I would tell anyone who is looking into setting up a podcast network. One is just, be sure that you want to do it, because it does take a lot of work and a lot of time. And also understand the critical role that social media is going to play in the kind of advertising that you need to do to grow a social, or to grow a podcast network. And that was one of the reasons I stepped away and handed the reins over to Kevin, was that I, just couldn't do it. I was like, this is not what I'm in. I don't enjoy this anymore. I spend a lot of time, and I just didn't have, not that I didn't enjoy it. That's not the right way to put it. It's that I was spending so much time doing the day-to-day maintenance stuff, and what I really wanted to do was just create podcasts, which is what I started doing. And so the more work I was doing with the network as a whole, the less time I had to spend doing the thing that really got me excited about doing podcast work in the first place. And so that's why I kind of, found somebody to take it over. Because I understood my limitations, that I didn't have the fire to do it the way that I did when I first started. And I just wanted to make podcasts. And also that I didn't have a real vision for how do you take this. I'd been running it for 5 years. So how I need to give it to somebody that has an idea of what 5 years from now could look like. And, could there be different shows and different ways to advertise and different ways to engage the community that I'm not thinking of. And so that's what, and I was so happy when somebody took it over, because otherwise it was just going to stop. And I'd done enough work with the network that it was going to bum me out if it just stopped being a thing. Although I was prepared for that, I was kind of making moves behind the scenes a little bit to say, okay, well, if this were to completely break apart, here's what I would do to just keep my own stuff going. So I was very pleased when somebody stepped up and took it over, and he's been doing really good stuff with the Patreon and giving out free video games and doing some community stuff and all of that. So it's been really kind of heartwarming to see all of that happen. But it's tough. It's a lot of work, because you're also dealing with a lot of different personalities, and there's it requires a lot. There's a degree of technical know-how for keeping a website going and trying to keep everything working on that end, and you're kind of herding cats because you're trying to get the host to all pull in the same direction. And it's no easy feat, and anyone who does it is my hat is off to them. But it's a lot of fun too, for all my complaining about it. Like, there is it's always nice when you're making moves and adding new shows and getting rid of some other shows that maybe don't quite fit the ethos that you're trying to achieve, and you start seeing like people respond to that, whether it's people contacting you directly or the download numbers going up or whatever it is. All of that stuff is rewarding. But it's also maddening too when just like 1 month downloads are lower for no good reason that you can think of, and like, what did I do wrong? Did I not advertise in the right way? Did I not advertise in the right place? Blah blah blah. It's but that's the kind of thing that I was glad to ultimately give up, just so that I could concentrate on making the shows. And I'm in a place now where I don't necessarily, like, obviously I want people to listen, and I enjoy it when they do, and I enjoy the feedback. And we just dropped an episode on Pick Six Movies on the movie Runaway with Gene Simmons and Tom Selleck, and there were a number of people that were responding to that movie and some of the jokes we made about it and so forth. And that kind of thing is a lot of fun. But I do it at this point. The work that I do with podcasting, I do it just because I enjoy doing it. And even if I had like 5 listeners, I would probably still do it the same way that I'm doing it now. Which again is kind of fun. I like feeling like I'm doing this for the love of the game and not
Yeah.
Not because I'm trying to achieve anything. I'm not goal oriented. The goal is the show. And that's a nice place to be.
Yeah. I mean, the goal is having fun doing the show, and as long as that's happening, then the rest, can come and go, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Well, for the last question, before we get into the movie, I'm gonna. You're the first that I've kind of decided to start doing this, is to wrap up the interview portion with just a random movie question, and this can be any genre your answer. It's just the first movie that comes to mind when I ask for a sequel surpassing the original.
Oh, I mean, the obvious is Godfather 2, right?
That's the obvious, or one of the obvious choices, I would say.
Right.
Sure.
It's Godfather 2 or Empire, the first two that pop into my head. Or Empire 2. Empire Strikes Back being the superior film to Star Wars. I'm trying to think if there's a better, more obscure example. But I keep going back to Godfather 2. Like that expands on the Godfather in every way and is an incredible movie.
I'll say, if anything, I'm just glad you didn't do something that would disappoint me and say Terminator 2, because a lot of people would.
No.
Like, don't do it, please.
No, I mean, there is an argument to be made for Aliens. I don't think that it's better than Alien, but it is just so different and so much its own thing that I think you can argue, hey, Aliens is as good, but I don't think it surpasses.
I think what makes the Aliens argument so tough is each movie is trying to do a different thing, and each movie does what it's trying to do so well that it almost comes down to, well, what do you personally like better, a straight horror movie or like an action movie with elements of the horror in it? Because I'm also like an Alien over Aliens guy, but I mean, all considerations aside, I still love Aliens as well. It's just a very different movie in tone, and it's like, even though I personally always argue Alien is better, it's like I totally understand why the people in the Aliens camp are in the Aliens camp, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I'll tell you one. Here's a sequel better than the original. Friday the 13th 4, the final chapter, better than the original Friday the 13th.
Yeah, and it's funny because that's one of the iconic slasher franchises, I guess, with that I would say multiple entries surpass the original for me. I mean, just me personally, but definitely, I mean, I just had Brian Sammons on the previous episode, and we did Friday 4, and that's his number 1 of the franchise. And I've always said it's probably definitely the number 1 depiction of Jason Voorhees himself. I tend to be like a Friday 3 as my favorite, but it's all very close when it comes to the first 5 Friday the 13th. I would say they definitely have that feel to them that starts to change drastically once we get to Jason Lives. But for the most part, yeah, those first 5 I enjoy for different reasons for each one,
Yeah. 4 for me is the one that I can watch just any time. It's so weird. The fact that Crispin Glover brings this kind of manic energy to it, and there's a strange sort of family story happening in that one, and it's got a great Jason Voorhees performance. It's really vicious, and yeah, that's the absolute best. Part 4 way better than part 1 in my mind, for sure.
Definitely. Okay. Well, good stuff there. I figured, if with this question, it's like if you had to fall back on like the bigger choices, that's fine too. Yeah, just because I kind of like just randomly came up with it at the last minute, and I'm like, Bo, I know he'll have answers for this one.
Yeah, there are a number of examples of it, but it's, you don't want to go with the most obvious of, hey, Empire Strikes Back is better than Star Wars. It's like, yeah, no kidding. That's a way more interesting movie. Yeah.
For sure, for sure. All right. Well, here comes the portion where Bo sort of takes over. So for those listening to this for the first time, maybe I ask the guest to pick a movie for us to discuss, and it can be across any genre. And the only real ask is hopefully the movie has some type of significance to them. It doesn't have to be their favorite movie of all time, and nothing like that. It can be as simple as, hey, this is a movie I saw at a significant point in my life, or hey, I love this director and this is their first movie. But we're gonna find out now what movie Bo picked and why he picked it. So, Bo, take it away with your movie selection.
Yeah, I wanted to stay in the horror genre, so I went with a movie about a man haunted by an invisible 7-foot rabbit. No, it's 1950s Harvey, starring Jimmy Stewart. Other actors for sure, but this is really Jimmy Stewart's film.
We predict you'll greet Harvey with laughter and rousing applause. How do we know? Because for 5 long years, audiences did just that on Broadway for the most talked about Pulitzer Prize-winning comedy of our time. And now at last, Harvey comes to the screen, better, richer, funnier than it ever was on the stage. Starring James Stewart as Elwood P. Dowd, America's most amiable citizen, with hilarious Josephine Hull and a grand cast. And once again, the critics are raving. Says Luella Parsons, and Walter Winchell. And Hedda Hopper.
It's based on a Pulitzer Prize winning play, and definitely has that feel. Like, you can see how this would be a play because there are a couple of major settings. It's basically their house, the house of Jimmy Stewart and his sister and niece, the mental institution, which, let me just say up front, not the most progressive and modern look at mental illness for sure. But that, and then there's a bar that features fairly heavily into the film, and
Yeah.
Which has my favorite stuff in it. Had you seen this before, though? Just out of curiosity.
I had not. This is actually a first time watch for me. And when I was looking it up, I've seen that not only was it a play, but they've actually made this story into a movie a few times.
Yeah, and so I will say why I picked this movie, because when you approached me about this, and first of all, again, I appreciate you doing so, because this stuff is a lot of fun. But also when you said, like, pick a movie that's significant to you, and there are plenty of horror movies that I talk about all the time, but I don't get an opportunity to talk about this movie very much. And this, along with It's a Wonderful Life, are very significant films for me. Because I was a big Jimmy Stewart fan from the time I was a kid. And I am not so old that Jimmy Stewart movies were like contemporary to my experience. He was an old actor, and his movies were very old before I was ever born. But I had famously shitty parents, and not just because they took me to see Alien, they were just bad parents. Like a lot of childhood trauma and all that kind of shit. But the one thing that I had was Jimmy Stewart, and this movie and It's a Wonderful Life both figured very prominently in my idea of what normal human behavior was. And especially this film, that the character of Elwood P. Dowd was the kind of person that you should strive to be. And so the first time I saw this movie, I recognized there's almost like a Forrest Gump quality, except that he's not mentally handicapped. It's just that person that's so extraordinarily nice that it forces the world around him to change. That he is such a kind and such a genuine person that no matter what happens to him, he's gonna be fine. And I think when I was a kid, I needed that kind of role model because I didn't have it in my own life at the time. And it's one of the reasons I love movies as much as I do now, because movies, and especially a movie like Harvey that I saw pretty early, that they were movies that taught me that cinema can be more than just entertainment, that it can kind of display an ethos, a way to live your life in a way. And especially a character like Elwood Dowd, who was, even no matter how terrible the world around him was, he was always going to maintain optimism and kindness. And that really, like, I responded to that in a really fundamental way. And to this day, there are lines in Harvey that will almost bring me to tears because it means so much to me as a person. One of them being, later in the movie when he's talking to Mr. Chumley, the head of the institution, and he says, "In life, you may be oh so smart or oh so pleasant. For many years, I was smart. I recommend pleasant." And it's like as soon as I heard that line, I was probably in middle school the first time I saw this. As soon as I heard that line, I was like, that feels right. That feels like a true thing to me. And I haven't always embodied it. It is a difficult path to walk, but it is something that the older I get, the more true it feels, and the more I try to be that person. I try to be my inner Elwood P. Dowd. Because I've always admired it, and I've tried to do that, but I think it's only now that I really feel like I've captured some of that, and try to treat everybody that I meet with a degree of kindness, like not as Pollyanna-ish as maybe Elwood P. Dowd, because I'm not that good, but yeah, it was a movie that just embodied for me what I thought people ought to be like. And because he's different, like like the world around him understands that he is not a normal person, but his kindness and his humanity are such that it's not Elwood Dowd that changes, it's the world that bends to his kindness. And that was something I thought was really beautiful about the film.
Yeah, I was reading some reviews after watching the movie, because it's pretty common for me if it's a movie I'm seeing for the first time, just to kind of get an idea of like what others think of it, maybe do a deep dive into it. And I think in one of the reviews, it was one sentence that really struck me. It was like, this movie will tell you about the importance of being nice. And I was like, well, that kind of sums it up. I thought the character that James Stewart played, man, just it seems like that's the kind of guy you want in your life,
Yeah.
like you you put the imaginary rabbit, or what is it they refer to it, a puka, I
A
think.
puka. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, puka. Put that aside, and it's just every interaction this guy has. It's like always the brightest outlook, always trying to see the positive. Very warm to pretty much everyone he comes across, regardless of the way they're reacting to him. And yeah, the importance of being nice. One of the first scenes that really jumped out to me and just cracked me up was the party scene. I think it's his family. They're having some type of like cocktail party or something, and
Yeah, it's a coming out
he,
party for his niece. Yeah.
yeah, and so he shows up to the party, and you have the couple members of his family that obviously know what's going on with him, but they're trying to like not very successfully like hide it, contain it, and eventually they can't, and he's there in the main room of the party introducing Harvey to everybody, and just the looks on their faces, it's all over. We tried, but no. But James Stewart, his charm, and what a pro. Because I got to think back. You see now this type of stuff, green screened, or they'd have someone probably there with him that they can digitally alter out after the fact to make it more realistic. But what a job by James Stewart. Every interaction with Harvey, it just comes off as like as if Harvey's actually there, and that's a tribute to James Stewart himself. It was like a masterful job.
Yeah. The only thing you see of Harvey is the portrait that he
Mhm.
has done of him and the big rabbit, and the hat that's got the ear holes cut in it. And
Right.
that's the only evidence, other than seeing some stuff move around at the end of the movie, that Harvey is real. And there was some my understanding at least is that when they were making the movie, there was some idea that they were going to play it so that you never really knew if Harvey was real or not. And I think it was Jimmy Stewart who insisted, hey, at the end of the movie we should know that he's a real thing. And that's why you get this sort of the gate opening and closing
Mhm.
at the end of the movie. But yeah, I love that scene where he goes to the party because of him. Like everybody in the family is trying to hide the fact that he seems to be a crazy person who sees this giant rabbit. And the scene though that I think the first time I saw it, the scene where I knew that like, oh, this movie is going to be one of my favorite movies forever and ever. And it's the scene where they track him down to the bar, and Jimmy Stewart convinces like the new or the younger psychiatrist and the nurse to dance and so forth. And when they start dancing, he just wanders outside to sit, among the trash in the alley or whatever. Um, and that whole scene where they talk to him about why Harvey's name is Harvey, and the psychiatrist kind of implying, well, maybe you had a childhood friend named Harvey, and perhaps that's why that you're creating this fantasy figure of a long lost friend or something. And Jimmy Stewart, who I think he's a wonderful actor, in the Hitchcock stuff as well as movies like this. I think for the time in which he was acting, when things could be very theatrical, and this movie has a lot of very theatrical arch performances in it too, especially the woman who plays his sister is very stage acty in the movie. But Jimmy Stewart always strikes me as being very natural, like natural in a way that a lot of modern actors are. And when during the course of that scene in the alley, when they were talking to him about the first time he met Harvey, and it's a very funny story about like a buddy of his being real drunk, and Harvey is saying like, oh well, he was a little spiffed, wasn't he? But when he goes on to talk about how the line is something to the effect of, we sit at the bar, Harvey and I, And people tell us all the big terrible things that they've done and all the big wonderful things that they're going to do, because nobody ever brings anything small into a bar. And I introduced them to Harvey, and he is bigger and grander than anything that they offer me. And he says the very same people seldom come back, but that's envy, my dear, and there's a little bit of that in the best of us. And it's just this wonderful monologue that he gives. And I think it's kind of like wonderful and sweet and heartbreaking all at the same time. And I just love Jimmy Stewart's delivery of it all. As you said, his kindness in the movie, like when he picks the flower and gives it to the nurse. And there's a joke there where he says, would you wear this flower? I seem to have misplaced my buttonhole. And when he, fixes the flower to her collar, he says, when you wear that, you make it beautiful. And it's those little moments where you're like, I wish I could be this guy, who is constantly finding the best qualities in people. And even at the point, like the whole climax of the movie kind of rests on the idea that they're going to give him this formula that will shock him back into reality. And he doesn't want to take it, obviously, because they're telling him like, hey, you'll stop seeing Harvey once you take this. And his sister is telling him to take it. And he says, I like this because there's an element of conflict in this discussion, and that keeps everyone interested and gives everybody a stake in the conversation. And so even in this moment where he is being forced to make this decision about giving up his one true friend or disappointing his sister, like that is not what first comes out of his mouth is a defense of Harvey or anything like that. It's just like, isn't this wonderful that we're all having this argument, because that means we're all engaged and we're all talking to one another. And it's that kind of stuff that I find really like charming and wonderful about this movie. But I'm excited because you haven't seen it. Like I'm curious, aside from him just being a super nice guy, did the movie land for you at all? Because it's hard for me to tell because I've seen it a million times. But like when you watched it, did you actually enjoy the watching of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's heavily carried by James Stewart's performance, obviously, but I thought it was funny. I love kind of the whimsical nature of comedies in this era. And I mean, it's not exclusive to this era, but I think we're still in that age of cinema where being whimsical is a good thing. And that whimsical nature shows up in a lot of comedies, a lot of musicals too at the time. And it's something you don't see a lot these days. Like once in a while you'll get movies like this, but man, it definitely transports you to a different era, or at least an era depicted on screen. I mean, no era is free of many problems, but yeah, I also could definitely tell that it was based on a play. It just felt like that, like some of the set pieces definitely lend credence to that. But I enjoyed the movie a lot. Sometimes going back, you never know, especially as a first time watch, because it's very hard not to view things through like the lens of modern times. But I also know like some of my favorite movies are 50 years old now at least. So and the fact that like you picked it, I was like, okay, if anything, it's gonna be a good movie. Will it land for me? That was the question. But yes, I had a fun time with it. I love the tone of the movie. I thought for being like an hour and 44, I thought it moved pretty quickly. Like it just goes from scene to scene. And yeah, I just thought it was a real feel good movie. Now it's funny too, because I've also heard like that some people thought the movie was like a metaphor for alcoholism too, because maybe he's a drunken That's why he's imagining this puka. So I did appreciate kind of like the wide ranging. It's almost like in modern times, like people breaking down like the themes of a Jordan Peele movie. Now, I'm not saying this gets that deep, but I did like reading the different reviews and the different breakdowns and depictions of what different people thought were going on in it. It also, one of my enjoyment about reading reviews on like older movies, even though some of the reviews are obviously modern, like written a lot in modern times, is people think film criticism is like a new thing. It's like, no, like there's like critical breakdowns and uber analysis going on movies, like even back then, where people wanted to get at the root of like what's behind the writing and what's behind what's going on screen. So yeah, I had a lot of fun with this movie. It definitely hit 100% for me.
Oh, that's great. I'm so happy to hear that, because when I was going back through it, I was thinking how much I love it. There's a line that the sort of the orderly that Mr. Cecil, I think is his name, the one who ends up falling in love with the niece. But there's a line he has that is maybe one of the most like 1950s era bits of dialogue I've ever heard, where he says it's when he tracks Elwood down to his house and he's not there, but he's talking to the sister or the niece rather, and she makes him an egg salad sandwich. And he says, listen, there are a couple of things I know for sure. And she's like, oh, what's that? And he says, you can make a really great egg salad sandwich. And also, your uncle is one of the biggest fruitcakes that ever stuck his puss into our nut house. And that combination of words delights me to no end.
Yeah. I remember. Yeah, I was just going to say, when I was watching the movie, my wife was around, like she wasn't there for the whole movie, but she was in the room when that line hit, and she kind of did a double take at the TV. Like, he said, what now?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was hilarious.
Yeah. I like it anytime somebody refers to somebody's face as a puss. It just makes me laugh. But yeah, and like I said, there's almost this Forrest Gump quality of this very likable guy, instead of going through like, Zelig like going through these historical moments. It's just sort of a day in the life, because the whole thing takes place in the course of a day. But seeing how, he just is unflappable in the face of even when they tell him like, hey, your sister was trying to have you committed. She got power of attorney over you. And he says, Vita did all that today. Boy, she is really something, isn't she? Like, being kind of impressed by the fact that his sister was doing this like grand conspiracy against him. His response to it is like, she is just a Spitfire. You got to hand it to her, and not being upset about the fact that it's all working against him.
Yeah, he almost has that Ned Flanders like demeanor without like the religious undertones, like where it's like no matter what's propagated against him or said to him, he doesn't change his outlook or demeanor with anyone in any situation.
Yeah, and there's a spirit of poetry to him as well. Like when he's at the bar with the doctor and the nurse, and he says, when he's saying, here's what happened to Mr. Chumley, the head of the institution who tracked him down to this bar. And he said, I introduced him to Harvey and we had a few drinks and the evening wore on. That's such a lovely expression. With your permission, I'll say it again. The evening wore on. And just, like him just loving this turn of phrase, and pausing in this story just to enjoy language for a second. It's that kind of stuff that really makes me fall in love with this movie over and over again. And there are some jokes that are very corny because of the time that the movie was made, but I do think that Jimmy Stewart's performance there's a timeless quality to it. And also the idea, like, when you get to the end of the film, there is this moment where Mr. Chumley asks, like, hey, can Harvey come with me? And, Jimmy Stewart has to make this decision about, like, well, do I give up my oldest and only friend, this invisible rabbit, so that this guy can go off to Akron, Ohio, and have a woman, pat his hand and say, poor dear. Which I love Jimmy Stewart saying, look, I think you're making a mistake by not having the woman say anything other than poor dear, because if she's been around at all, she's probably picked up some interesting news items. And I know you're making a mistake about all that beer and no whiskey, but sure, I've never heard Harvey say an unkind word about Akron, so he might do it for you. What is when he's telling that like Harvey can stop time? Now, Harvey can stop a clock, and not only has Harvey overcome space and time, but any objections, is how he puts it. Oh, I love the language in this so much. But but yeah, so Mr. Chumley theoretically is gonna go off to Akron with Harvey, and there's this moment where the only time you ever see Jimmy Stewart, even unhappy in the movie, is him leaving and kind of understanding, well, maybe I don't have this friend of mine anymore. Which of course leads to the final line of the movie where Harvey does in fact come back. You see the gate open and close, and he says, well, I thought you were going to go with Mr. Chumley. What's that? Oh, well, thank you, Harvey. I prefer you too. And it's a real crowd pleaser of a movie. I wonder how it would play for kids, but I know as a kid myself, when I saw it, again, by the time I saw it, this movie was, 30 years old. If not older, is older than that, I'm sure, 35. But even then, I felt like this is somebody worth emulating and looking up to. Because no matter how, like he's clearly an oddball, he's a weirdo. Elwood Dowd is in the movie, but he's such, like, he just can't be shaken from being true to himself, for being optimistic and kind and considerate and interested in other people, like the dude at the bar who just got out of prison, and he's like, oh, what have you been doing, making license plate for the state? How was that work? Was that interesting work that you did? And, oh, I can take it or leave it. All that stuff. It's just like really heartwarming in a way that, like when we were talking about movies like The Sadness being kind of dour earlier. Harvey is the Sadness of a movie that is eminently positive and believes in the decency and goodness of people. And that can be incredibly powerful, even in the face of an institution like this mental hospital that he's being subjected to, that his kindness and his decency changes the minds of everyone around him. And I think that's a really wonderful message.
Yeah, I another word that comes to mind for a movie like this to me is like wholesome. It, for the most part, I think this is a movie you could throw on for the whole family. I think everyone would get something out of it. It might be a tough sell on kids this generation if they're too young, just because they're thrown into like the modern digital world so soon, so quick, consuming so much. But I mean, as far as like the content, I think everyone would love this movie, unless you're just wrong, and you're wrong about the reason. Then maybe not. But
yeah,
but I think this is like you said, this is very crowd pleasing to me. I think.
Yeah. I'm glad you enjoyed it because, like I said, this and It's a Wonderful Life are both movies that kind of taught me the lesson when I was a kid that, just basic human decency is what's important. And the fact that no matter how big a small or life you lead, it's the kindness and the effect that you have on the people around you that is your true legacy. And so I find both of those movies to be like It's a Wonderful Life is a little bit more grim because at a certain point Jimmy Stewart tries to commit suicide. Let's not forget that in that movie. But but the ultimate message is much the same of Harvey, which is you just have to be kind and decent to people, and if you do that with enough determination and persistence, that the world around you can change. And maybe there isn't a much better message you can give to anyone in the world that we live in currently, where everyone is so quick to point out everyone else's flaws and be so antagonistic, that just being kind is somewhat revolutionary. And I love these movies for it.
I think it's almost like an important message for today's world, because despite I look at it like this, in a world of billions, or just if you lower that just to our country of multiple millions of people, it's very rare you're going to encounter people that are 100% your same line of thinking on it, whatever it is. But just in general, kindness is going to make a lot of stuff not matter as much. And I think this movie leans into that, where it's really your kindness and what you kind of put out there that is the factor, and what can really change. You can change other people as well, if that's what they're inundated with. And it's a very kind of uplifting movie at the same time too.
Yeah. I'm glad you liked it. I hope if someone listening to this who has never seen the movie Harvey gets to experience it and enjoy it for the first time, then that what more can you ask for? Like, that is the real winner.
For sure.
Yeah, it's terrific. But yeah, I'm so glad you liked it. I hope that we can all be a little more Elwood P. Dowd as we're moving forward. I know watching it again, it's sort of the booster shot for being nice to people. Of like, oh yeah, right, I do want to be a nicer, kinder person.
Yeah, and anyone that's looking for it, I know it's up on archive.org. I don't know if it's in the public domain officially, but archive.org is currently streaming it.
Yeah, and it's for rent on like Amazon and a bunch of other places. There, you can, if you want to see Harvey, you can absolutely see Harvey in a
definitely available to rent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we've talked a lot of movie stuff today, as well as this movie. But Bo, what are you currently up to, and where can people check out the works of Bo currently?
Yeah, you can hop over to legionpodcast.com. You can find the 3 shows that I do there. Pick 6 Movies, which I do with my buddy Chad, that I spend all that time editing. There's that. There's Duncan and Bo Come Correct, which is me and Duncan McLeish from Podcast Under the Stairs, doing all kinds of things. Currently, we are doing a series in which we are discussing all of the Pink Panther movies, which was Duncan's idea because I had never seen them. And
oh, wow.
So we're going through all those right now. We just did Inspector Clouseau, which is the 3rd chronologically, and it's the first time somebody other than Peter Sellers plays Inspector Clouseau. And it's Alan Arkin is Clouseau in the movie. And it's not a good movie, but it's fascinating. And we had a really interesting time talking about it. And then there's The Dark Parade, which is the weekly show. There's a new episode at least every Wednesday, if not more. Although I am currently going back to school to get my license to teach. And so it has been primarily just a weekly show of late, but there is a world in which once I'm finished with school, I'll get back to doing a couple of episodes a week. And also coming in October, check out legionpodcast.com and subscribe to that Legion podcast feed, because I will still be doing the 31 Days of October, where I do a mini review every day of October leading to Halloween, in which we, hopefully review a movie that is kind of special and perfect for the holiday. So we did, or I did, the last year was The Exorcist, and I think the year before that was, I'm trying to remember. It might have been the original Halloween, but I might be mistaken about that. I think Ghostwatch was the first Halloween. So Ghostwatch, The Exorcist, and this year yet to be named, although certainly selected. So all that stuff is coming up. It's spooky season is upon us. So I'm certainly getting in the spirit. Me and the boy are about to start building PVC zombies.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Out here, September is always kind of that weird month where I get to see everybody else like starting spooky season, and I'm staring at like 100 degrees on our weather forecast, and I'm just like, I can't bring myself to do it yet. It's just too freaking hot. I don't have the feeling. Usually, by the end of September, we get into, I guess, like normal heat here, but God, it's still like heat wave worthy weather here.
Yeah, you guys have had it rough in the West. I mean, it's still in the 80s here, so it's not, there is not a present chill to the air, but it's definitely going to be chillier sooner than what you guys are seeing in the West. But yeah, like yesterday I made the trip to Lowe's where I got all the pipe and everything, and it's like, all right, well, we're gonna do our first test zombie next weekend and see where we are, if we've got all our measurements right, and then start. The goal is that we're gonna have 2 of them motorized. So we'll see how it goes. Yeah, I'm excited. It's gonna be a lot of fun to put those together, and so we're gonna try to put the first together next weekend, and then make a trip to the Goodwill to get clothes for our zombies. So that
I was just gonna say I still have it's about from the torso higher, like a motorized zombie on wheels that we bought years ago. The motor has long died out, but I still every year put it on the porch as like a stationary. Like I have like tombstones and like little creepy fences I put around to make like a mock cemetery, and I always put the now non-motorized zombie as part of the cemetery setup. So it still gets quite the use once we put up our decorations.
Yeah, the idea is we're going to have a total of 6 zombies, 2 of them coming out of the graves, 4 of them approaching the house or at the house, and then we've got screens and projectors to kind of project against the windows and everything. So it should be pretty good. I'm very excited for what it's going to look like once it's all done. So so it's like all of September is the staging, right? Like we're getting all of the materials and starting to put things together, and then as October begins, we start to roll that out, and it's probably going to be about mid-October before we put it up, just so that if we're going to anger the neighbors, it will be only for a couple of weeks, because otherwise they're going to be staring for a month at, corpses in the front yard.
Nice. Cool. Well, Bo, I want to thank you again for joining me on this episode and saying, hey, Mike, watch this movie.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll have to definitely get together in the future and do some more stuff. But yeah, thanks again. And to the listeners, thank you for listening. And I'll catch you back with another episode of Watch This Movie, Mike.